Hello, I'm Jenny Miller on behalf of the Cheltenham Local History Society, and I'm talking to Joan Whiting-Moon about her first move to Cheltenham in the 1970s. Thank you, Joan.
By 1971, both our children were at Dean Close School, and I was a history teacher at Pates Girls' Grammar School in Albert Road. By 1973, I was tired of commuting, and so we decided to buy a house in Cheltenham, despite the fact that my husband still worked in Gloucester. It was a memorable time because 1973 was a period of national strikes, restrictions on power usage. There were 3-day weeks for working, and this on the on-off days candles were used. So visiting estate agents after my teaching day was quite interesting because very often they could show me their folders and brochures of properties by candlelight. So that was rather difficult. In the end, we decided to buy a property in Lansdowne Parade, which is 1840s property facing Lansdowne Green, and it backed onto Cheltenham Ladies' College hard courts. Now, this view from my teenage son's window of lissom young ladies playing hockey and tennis 20 yards away also interested his friends to come and have tea, as you can imagine. What the estate agents probably didn't know was that the house came complete with a ghost. Ghosts are not unknown in Cheltenham. One day an elderly lady knocked on the door and explained she had lived with her parents in the house in the 1930s. Her father was an engineer with Doughty's aircraft factory in Churchdown, but her mother was never at ease in the house, and after a year or so they left. She then asked if I was happy in the house. Did I feel comfortable? All was fine, I said. Well, she said, there were rumours that a manservant had been killed at the bottom of the basement stairs, and that he had a restless spirit. I replied that my children had probably chased him out. They cooked powerful chutney in the butler's pantry, and my son rocked the foundations playing shattering pop music and did electronic experiments. The ghost must have felt very ill at ease and departed. Lansdowne at that period in the 70s was very much an area of decayed splendour. The great houses in the terraces were divided into innumerable flats, and the Crescent had the reputation of charging the lowest rents, and so this affected the clientele in the area. A door would open, and 6 large dogs of indeterminate breed would rush out onto the green. Or perhaps a streaker. Streaker were very fashionable for some reason in the 1970s. Naked young men or women would dash onto cricket pitches and cause consternation. So seeing a streaker was in chime with the period of the time. However, the Guinness Trust realised the potential of these properties. After all, Lansdowne Crescent was the only crescent which bowed outwards instead of curving inwards. And so they decided to buy up some of the properties in Lansdowne Crescent and do them up and turn them more efficiently into flats. And this had a knock-on effect that the neighbouring houses were also renovated. My son said just before this, he was with the combined cadet force at school, and he was learning to fly, and he flew in a chipmunk plane, and he could see that the frontage of the Crescent was leaning away from the rest of the building. So Guinness came to the rescue just in time. It did have a knock-on effect, though, of more restoration and upgrading, and a rapid change in property prices. Our Lansdowne Parade House cost about £300 in 1840. In 1973, when we bought it, it was around £16,000. By the 21st century, the houses along the parade were selling from £400,000 up to £1 million. Change of usage from the 1930s also had its impact. During the 30s, 40s, 50s, Regency houses in the middle of town were changed into offices, and the suburbs meanwhile spread. However, in the 1980s, there was a change to living in the centre of towns, walking into town, wider pavements, and changes in traffic flows. Retirement properties were no longer isolated in the countryside because those retirees wanted the amenities of town close at hand, and this the Cheltenham festivals offered. I became a regular supporter of the Cheltenham Literary Festival in the 1970s, and for me this was a delightful walk to Imperial Square, along tree-lined avenues in the autumn, and feeling that this was a very pleasant experience before I even got into the tent. However, in the 70s, technology was in its infancy. Mics with snakes of cables on the platform, and lecturers would grow impatient with the young man in charge of the projector. It was always quite interesting, though, to see which elderly professor might trip over the cables. Also, as we still have, autumn violent storms would come over, and then the canvas would flap, and the speaker would be drowned out by pouring rain and violent winds. However, it was still an occasion when one discussed over coffee afterwards with friends whether the new book was worth buying, whether the speaker had given an adequate review of his or her topic. It is still a delight in the 21st century. One extra special enticement was Alan Hancock's basement second-hand bookshop. He was a great supporter of the festival, and he had a second-hand bookshop which went from the basement in the prom out into Montpellier Street at the back. And as you went through different rooms in the basement, the finds of all kinds of obscure books, of leather-bound books, even comics. It had such an array of books and some pictures as well, I seem to remember. It was just a delight to mosey along through his bookshop and come out at the other side, usually clutching one or two books one had bought in between time. Waterstones had just arrived in the Cheltenham Promenade. Waterstones then was a new boy on the bookshop scene, and we were thrilled with the first shop on the promenade because it had classical music playing, there were chairs to sit down, and there were interesting new books, not just the bestsellers with cut-price deals. And so again, this was an excitement because he would probably buy in books which were not from the big publishers. And so it was finding something that you hadn't thought about and caught one's attention. And that was Cheltenham's excitement at that point, things that you hadn't thought about. And one particular shop, which contained many things that one never thought about, was Summerfield's antique shop on the corner of Montpellier Terrace facing Montpellier Gardens. The windows were crammed with china, pictures and curios of all different kinds, all not exactly arranged in the windows, but more or less sitting on top of one another. Well, I took a fancy to a Victorian workbox. The first thing was to persuade him to get it out of the window. Then he had to be persuaded to put a price on it. This would take about an hour. And when he died in 1989, there was so much stuff on the various floors in the shop, and also in his Bays Hill house, just simply crammed with everything. And in order to have an auction to sell off the contents, tents were erected on the racecourse for the auctions, and it took several days for the auctions to be completed. A large amount of money was raised, which was partly donated to the art gallery in order to support some of its work.